Good afternoon. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. First, let me welcome you. I'm Dr. Shannon Marquez, the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs from the Drexel School of Public Health. We're very excited, extremely honored today to have a very special Public Health Grand Rounds lecture, which is being co-sponsored by our colleagues in the Drexel University College of Medicine, as well as the College of Nursing and Health Professions. It is indeed an honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Marjorie Agoston, who is a poet, fiction writer, memoirist, anthologist, human rights activist, and a professor at Wellesley College. Born in Maryland and raised in Chile, she moved to the United States due to the overthrow of the Chilean government by General Pinochet's military coup. Dr. Agosin earned a BA degree at the University of Georgia and an MA at Indiana University. She completed her PhD at Indiana University as well. She's earned notability for her outspokenness for women's rights in developing countries, and her deep social concern and accomplishments have earned her many awards and recognitions, including the United Nations Leadership Award for Human Rights, and she has gained an international reputation among contemporary women of color. Dr. Agosin has also won many important literary awards. Her creative work is inspired by the theme of social justice, as well as the pursuit of remembrance and the memorialization of traumatic historical events, both in the Americas and in Europe. In 2002, the Chilean government awarded her the Gabriela Mistral Medal of Honor for Lifetime Achievement. She's recognized in both North and South America as one of the most versatile and provocative Latin American writers. And she became a writer to make a difference. I wanted to change the world through peace and beauty, she said. And today, she is not only a writer, but also a Spanish professor at Wellesley College. It is indeed an honor to introduce Dr. Marjorie Agoston.
Okay, I hope you can see me. Okay, thank you, Dr. Vasquez, and thank you for your presentation. And when Dr. Vasquez said I was born in Bethesda, Maryland, it's true, but I don't have a Maryland accent. I don't know what a Maryland accent is, but when I was 3 months old, I went back with my parents and my sister, that was also born in Bethesda, Maryland, back to Chile. And yes. So the accent you will hear really is a Spanish accent because I learned English when I came to the United States. Can you hear me? The mic? Okay. There, you can hear me. So this morning I've had a very busy day, a wonderful day. I spoke to the Humanities Grand Round and spoke about the humanities, creativity, and medicine. And I want to thank Dean Shitlow and Dr. Levison for arranging this visit, and of course the School of Public Health, of Nursing. And today's presentations will be about not exactly the same, but about creativity and gender and women's lives in Latin America. So I know that I have a certain amount of time, and then I want very much to engage in a conversation. I will first read you a little bit about a question that many people may have curiosity. How do you become a poet? What are the experiences or the sensory experiences you are a part of that enables you to write? And the second part of this presentation will be a work that has changed my life dramatically and in many extraordinary ways. And it's a work I've done with the Mothers of the Disappeared in Chile, during the very horrific decade of the Pinochet dictatorship. So this is how the presentation will unfold, and then hopefully we will have some questions. So first, I will just read you some thoughts about how I became a writer and why I write about women. As a young girl, I grew up with a multiplicity of language. Ladino, which is ancient Jewish Spanish from the 15th century, to Yiddish, to Spanish, and to French. And really, I had practically no English at my school. And I forgot a very important language, Hebrew. I learned English by watching television, especially the soaps, as the word turns, in Athens, Georgia, where my parents emigrated, and reading with my mother the works of William Shakespeare that I was kind of asked to read for school. So at home, I read Shakespeare with a newly acquired Georgian accent, and of course my Spanish that I still carry with me with pride. I am, in a way, my language, and I am speaking to you in really borrowed words from another language. I also, in Latin America, grew up immersed in diverse communities and communities that were intertwined regardless of their origins and economic status. And this is an important point I want to share. Most people believe that Latin America is a class-divided and oriented society. In many ways, like the United States, it is, but in many ways, it's not. The neighborhoods, the borders are not so clearly divided, and you can be in a shanty towns and a few blocks later in a beautiful residential neighborhood. Very poor people live in the hills, very different than here. And very rich people live in the plains, in El Plano. But what I like to say is that there's interaction, conversations everywhere. The streets are a place of dialogue. People speak always about the economy, about maybe electing rich presidents because they don't need to rob others, but I guess this is not the case here, and about the skyrocketing prices of tomatoes, which is a daily conversation. I love the conversations in the streets and the market, and what I loved the most was the spontaneous and intuitive ability to trust strangers. And this is what I think defines a bit life in the streets in Latin America. Sadly, all changed too quickly for my family, for myself, with the advent of the military dictatorship in 1973 that took away not only our liberty, but really took away our essence and our souls. I want to share with you what shaped me as a poet to make certain choices, what moved me, and how I've been able to threaten gender, poetry, and human rights. And how, growing up, I had a passionate commitment to others, and something that we spoke this morning, a perpetual dialogue with empathy. How did empathy begin? Well, it began very early and at home. I happily went to the market almost every Thursday and Sunday with my mother, and I always noticed women, very young women, toothless. And their very young children, the women may have been 14, 15, 16, with very, very young children playing barefoot and with dirt. I always asked my mother, what happened to their teeth? That was the question that puzzled me the most. How come we had our teeth and all around us in the markets, young women did not? Then that was really my first lesson in public health. and in the health of communities. It is obvious, my mother said, a poor nutrition and even poorer hygiene. I always had a dream as a young girl that one day the women that I saw in the market and that by now knew our names, were able to smile without shame. That was a longing that I always had. Many, many years passed, maybe 25, 30 years, but I discovered that this dream that I had came true through the work of the wife of a democratic president, President Lagos, who created something very interesting that was called Una Sonrisa para Chile, a smile for Chile. And what this wife of the president did was free dental care for the women that had no teeth and for their children and for future generations. This is an important story to share because we are shaped by the politics of location, by the places that we grow up, by the languages that we speak, by our roots, and by our interactions with others. So this was one story that brought me closer to health, to empathy, to humanity, and to human rights. The other story was the commitment of my grandfather to bring Jewish and Spanish refugees to the south of Chile. And I also just learned in family conversation the importance of having an empathic heart, as well as the possibility to believe in change through the power of storytelling, of narratives, and to use the power of the imagination as the construction of the individual self, as well as the self committed to social justice. How does one become a poet? What is the experience of becoming a poet? I would like to say, first of all, that poetry is a very individual experience with language, but poetry without a community, it's a void, it disappears. The poet needs his or her voice as well as the voices of others, and poetry is truly an engagement with reciprocity, the reciprocity of the poet and the reader. So poetry is also an adventure in public health. Probably you've never heard of it, put it this way, but it's the experience of art brought to communities. As we all know, that health is not being properly or often improperly diagnosed, but live in a place that has the possibility of joy, of community, and most important, of art. The history of personal trauma as well as historical trauma is also the history of literature, the history of women writers, from the great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, who wrote about Stalin's regime of terror in a very long poem called Requiem, to the works of Charlotte Delbo, Gabriela Mistral, Adrienne Rich. When we left Chile, another choice was made, and was the choice of departing, not so much forced to leave, but choosing to leave a country that was ruled by a military dictatorship. Just like I was shaped by the image of women in the market without teeth, I was also shaped by the image of a great history teacher that also Dean Shidlow had as his own history teacher, and her name was Marta Alvarado. She always wore a very long red coat and red lipsticks, and she always made sure that you had clean shoes and a clean apron. And all of a sudden, she appeared at the airport and she said, "History is made by women. We are the guardians of memory." And I think these sentences she uttered in a Santiago winter also changed me carved me forever. And I began, after hearing this, to take the idea that women are the guardians of memory, to take this idea very, very seriously. Poetry then took a more vital term, especially when I came to the United States, not knowing English and writing in Spanish. I believe that poetry was not only an adornment, but a serious enterprise that was rooted in a social project. And I learned that poetry was an art of engagement, an art of witness, a site of witness, where the experience of writing a poem is as valid as the aesthetic representation of it, where the creative process is intertwined with the personal and the political. Therefore, from seeing the incredible lack of possibilities due to economic injustice as a young girl, to having a history teacher that says that women are the guardians, those that store women's memories and memories of their families and memories of the past, made me really think about the place of writing in a society, not as adornment, but as something of a vital necessity in order to understand who we are, and I call that big social project. The years in the United States, the early years, 16, 17, I also understood the problem of the loss of language, the loss of identity, dislocation, and the constant need to almost live in absence. And I also learned that the role of a poet is to recreate absence, to fill the spaces that have been torn from you. So I understood also that poetry can really speak for communities, and this may be, I say this with humbleness and without pretension, but that poetry can speak for communities with no voice. Mostly those communities are made up of women with no voice, disempowered, without political or economic power. And this is the second aspect of my conversation today, is to address the way in which gender and politics in Latin America are very important and very different from the situation of men. When women, and I'm speaking now of the time where I was in the United States and all of Latin America was ruled by military governments. When women became political activists, they were not only punished for being political activists, but they were punished because women were not supposed to be political activists. They were, in most cases, raped and brutally and verbally attacked because of their gender. When mothers lost their children to the military, they were simply taken away, abducted, disappeared. They were also punished as mothers because they were told that they were raising subversives. And at the same time, when you think of the faces in all of these, during all of these turbulent years, you see public faces, you see the faces of women. This is something really interesting. In one hand, women were completely disempowered by the male authorities of the military that always acted like a sinister father. That's something to really think about. We don't think of our parents as sinister, but in this case, this authoritarian figure. was the father that punished you if you believed in justice. At the same time, the absence of men in these countries, and I say absence because most of the male activists were being taken away, allowed for women to have another kind of power. And I think this is something that involves all of us, men, women, but involves the way in which women have engaged in politics. Of course, it was almost impossible to engage in politics in societies that were so repressive that books were censored. The medical schools has, instead of having physicians as the heads of the schools, had generals. And you wonder, how could you become empowered? And the most interesting is that women were empowered because they engage in a different kind of politics. I would like to say that they engage in the politics of the human soul. And as I said before, in all of the images that you saw all over the world, you saw mothers protesting, you saw mothers with the pictures of their children in the streets of Buenos Aires. And I think what women did that is so extraordinary, and I think maybe this is what women do today in many, many societies. Unfortunately, in places like Syria or Afghanistan, we are yet to see what these women are able to do. But I think the greatest victory of Latin American women was that they made the personal pain, especially the disruption of their home lives, a political story. And they move very much at ease from the personal to the historical to the political. And I think that is a great, great achievement. Having said that, my work brought me to understand how non-hierarchical politics and the power of the so-called the weak sex was really the most powerful form of power. When I was a graduate student in Indiana University, and Chile and Argentina and Uruguay were all undergoing very brutal dictatorships, and Brazil had just finished with their military dictatorship, I became involved with a group, and this is the second part of this talk, with a group of women who use cloth, but leftover cloth made out of burlap, to tell the narratives of their interrupted lives and use the cloth so that these tapestries, called arpilleras, would become the witnesses to what life was happening in Chile inside. So I became interested in another phenomenon that I'll just speak to you very briefly, and then we'll try to see a bit of the film. I became interested in how do women remember? What do women remember? What are the stories women tell? How do women choose to address trauma in their lives, either personal or political? In the case of Chile, I found it so important that women address trauma and the narratives of interrupted life through cloth. And I think that cloth predates writing. And I think cloth is ancient, is associated with the feminine, with the domestic. But what I was so interested in the arpilleras, that the domestic became subversive. And ordinary stitching became subversive stitching. And each arpillera told through cloth very traumatic stories. Exile, abduction, disappearance, and torture. I also think, and this is for so many of you that may be doing, let's say, community projects or projects with narratives, how when the human voice is silenced, you can use your hands to tell a story. And how the power of the human hands is also transformative. I also think this is an important, when I said how do women remember, you know that by the nature of memory, memory is always very subjective, very personal, very arbitrary, but most important, fragmented. And the arpilleras are made out of little pieces of cloth that are stitched together, and from something that has been torn apart, you are able to create something that is whole. So this work with arpilleras changed me personally, and also, I would say it in a very truthful way, it changed the world. It changed the way in which people speak about human rights, and especially the way women speak about human rights. And you could relate the work of the arpilleras to the AIDS quilt, to the quilts of the monks, to the Afghan rags, to the work of women in South Africa also doing patchwork. And it's very interesting to think about the process of stitching lives that have been torn apart. There's something healing, and there's something therapeutic in the composition of this cloth. So for many years I worked on this, and I was a very isolated person working on this because people thought that this had no universal value, but now the work of the arpilleras are practically known all over the world. And there are many, many communities in the United States, in Latin America, in Europe that are using narratives as a way of telling the stories they could not tell before. For example, many women in Catalonia, near Barcelona, or in Madrid speak about the Spanish Civil War through cloth. Or many people in Japan, and especially women, are embroidering the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So embroidering has many, many meanings. And in the case of the work with arpilleras that we will see, was dangerous, was subversive, but was ultimately liberating. And when Pinochet was arrested in London, you saw the women that embroidered going to London next to the Big Ben and making a huge arpillera, because somehow the world knew that he was really a criminal. I don't want to speak to you too much about the history of the arpilleras because I want you to see this brief 20-minute film that is the first documentary on the subject, and maybe somebody should stop me so we have time for questions. But as I address a group of you that works with public health, I think that the story that I was able to draw from this experience is the power of community. The necessity to share grief, because grief in isolation is almost death. And the way, and this is a really important message for all of us as we live in a democracy and in a civil society, the way ordinary people can make an extraordinary change in their lives, and the way horror can be translated into beauty and into possibilities, and the way in which the intimacy of a cloth and a story can also become historical. So we will see this film, and then because there's.
Y este taller nace como una necesidad en aquellos años 74-75 de denunciar lo que a nosotros nos estaba ocurriendo. Y en nuestra angustia nace esta idea de hacer estas arpilleras con género de nuestros propios vestidos, nuestras blusas, y nace la idea de la arpillera de denuncia.
Mi nombre es Irma Silva Vallejos de Müller. Hacer una arpillera duele bastante. Mi hijo Jorge desapareció el 29 de noviembre de 1974. Era camarógrafo de cine. Él desapareció junto con su novia, Carmen Bueno. Cuando bajaron en Los Leones, esquina de Bilbao, ahí estaba una camioneta con 2 hombres y una mujer, y fue el momento que lo detuvieron.
Jorge was detained and disappeared during the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. In 1973, General Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected government of President Salvador Allende in a violent military coup. Chile's long history of democracy was broken by 16 years of terror and repression. Thousands of Chileans were detained. Over 2,000 people were killed.
Mi nombre es Mireya Rivera Feli, soy esposa de Plutarco Cusí Benavides, detenido y desaparecido el 21 de septiembre de 1973. Trabajaba en una central hidroeléctrica, había tenido varios cargos del sindicato de trabajadores. Es ahí donde lo detienen al llegar al trabajo en un retén rural. Y hubieron testigos, pero posteriormente no quisieron atestiguar quién lo detuvo. Desde esa fecha yo empecé la búsqueda. Viajé mucho, retenes, regimientos, donde decían que habían detenido desaparecidos, iba.
Siempre conversé con Jorge. Él me contaba, me decía, mamá, están deteniendo gente, están asesinando gente, los llevan a los campos de concentración. Yo como en el principio no quería creerlo.
Although the government denied their existence, there were concentration camps throughout Chile, where thousands of prisoners were held in secret.
A cada día de visita en el campo de concentración de Tres Álamos, porque llamémoslo realmente por su nombre, porque fue un campo de concentración. Ahí me encontré con mucha gente, muchas madres, esposas, qué sé yo, que estaban buscando a sus familiares. Y nos fuimos realmente conociendo, porque cada una a otra se preguntaba, ¿quién tienes tú desaparecido? Uno decía, mi hijo, mi hija, mi esposo, mis padres.
When families of the disappeared asked about their loved ones, the authorities put them off and ridiculed their pleas for information. When they persisted, armed guards held them back by force.
Así son miles las historias. O cuando uno se acercaba mucho a un carabinero y los carabineros te ponían la metralleta en el estómago para que no avanzaran más. Entonces son recuerdos tan terribles y tan dolorosos que cuando uno los recuerda se muere de nuevo. Muere de nuevo.
Enrique, dale a tomar once.
Los primeros años fueron de mucha tensión, mucha angustia. Eso mismo se fue trasladando a los hijos. Crecieron en un ambiente tenso, de miedo, de terror. No supieron lo que era vivir una niñez normal. Sin duda que ha hecho mucha falta en el grupo familiar. El Vladi lo ha sentido más en ese aspecto, porque él que ha querido, siempre dice, ¿qué será de mi papá? Y bueno, en una oportunidad me dijo, bueno, lo voy a ver algún día o no, ya lo mataron. Entonces son cosas que uno le llegan mucho y empieza esa rebeldía, le renace nuevamente, y de no dejar la luz y saber la verdad y continuar siempre.
The families hope to find their loved ones alive in spite of rumors of executions. There are over 100 graves marked NN, no identification, in the General Cemetery of Santiago. Gravekeepers whispered of bodies buried at night in secret. They were said to be the remains of disappeared persons. The uncertainty was part of the government's campaign to silence opposition and control the people. On the surface, life appeared normal, but the press was censored and Congress had been dissolved. Members of opposition political parties were imprisoned, some of them never seen again. Behind the mask of an orderly society imposed by the dictatorship was the constant fear of who might be next. Repression against those who dared openly protest was swift and violent. There were people of courage who refused to remain silent. For some of the women, with family among the disappeared, the concern for their loved ones and their determination to know the truth proved stronger than fear. What the women lived, what they saw and heard, they expressed in their arpilleras. The arpilleras became the archives of a history the government tried to suppress. The first arpillera workshop was part of the Association of Families of the Detained Disappeared. The association was created by the Pro-Peace Committee, an ecumenical group organized after the coup to help victims of human rights abuses and their family.
I think I don't know where you can find this film in Women Make Films is distributed. But before we engage in a conversation, I'd like to just mention a few things. How you can make and create art, music, out of precarious materials, out of almost nothing. The arpilleras use burlap as a backing cloth, and as the years progressed and you realized that their children were never going to return, they were murdered. You see in the cemetery in unmarked graves, they use the cloth of the missing to create arpilleras. The arpillera is also a very powerful art of communal generosity. They are anonymous. They are just often signed with the initials of the women that make them. They are folded and sent abroad, pretending it's arts and craft. But I think this is a really important tradition to explore, from burial cloths made by women, from the quilting traditions of American women in the 19th century, this country has been so important in the making of patchwork, which really shows the fragmentations of women's lives. But what is so powerful for me is that these are victims of military repression, but they were able to tell their own stories. Their voices were censored, the language was censored, but not their hands and not the visual experience. And I am a believer that writing is the knowledge of human history, but so is cloth. I think that if you examine ancient Greece or ancient mythology, you will also see that the idea of spinning, of weaving, of embroidery are also part of the history of civilization. And the history of civilization is also the history of women. And my history teacher, our history teacher, was very right when she said that women make history. If you are interested in this art form, if students are interested in engaging in some of these workshops so that people tell the stories through cloth, you can Google arpilleras with A-R-P, and you will find all sorts of information on the web, all sorts of images. And now I'm very happy that a real museum, the Museum of National Hispanic Arts in Albuquerque, is having a major exhibit of the collection I've been collecting for over 30 years in about 2 weeks, but it's really a way to honor these women. For time's sake, I would like to ask if you have any questions about the conversation we had before, the making of poetry, or this video.
Thank you so much, and we want people to please go to the microphones when you ask your question, and Dr. Agosin, if you can also speak into the microphone so that we can record it.
Are there any questions?
I see a question back here.
So once again, Dr. Agosin, thank you for an inspirational talk. I was wondering if you could comment on something that you really alluded to but did not have time to discuss, which is, how does a society heal? The Chilean community was tremendous, it looked with tremendous hope at Allende, and then he was murdered, assassinated, and we know who was complicit in his death. Tremendous disappointment, not only because of the assumption of the dictatorship, but also the fact that he was a democratically elected official and killed. And then all those years of the trauma, so the disappointment and then the trauma, the disappeared, and all the horrific things. And then Pinochet disappears, but life doesn't become okay all of a sudden. So could you comment on what you know about how the collective community healed?
Thank you, Dr. Levison. I think this is the more complex question after trauma, whether it's individual or collective, and how do societies heal? Especially, and this is something that it may be frightening to understand, but you have to know that, for example, the torturers that torture maybe your the torturers in all of Latin America are walking freely in the streets. Very few of them are in prison. So there have been cases where a person takes a bath and his torturer is sitting next to him or her. This is something you perhaps cannot imagine. But Dr. Levinson's question is so incredibly important. How does a society heal and come together? In the case of Chile, even though we've had, it's been almost 35 years since Pinochet left power or chose to leave power, he was losing everything. I believe we have not healed yet. I believe we're still very polarized, and I believe that people are much more interested in erasing the past, in choosing amnesia over justice. I believe that, and throughout other examples, for example, the example of South Africa with an apartheid society, the truth commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions, were the beginning in which people could heal, where the perpetrators and the victims looked at each other, dialogue, addressed one another. That is one way of beginning this process of healing. But just like I said in this talk and in the morning, that at first you have these choices. I think the most important is for individuals to commit themselves to choose for justice. That each individual will say there was something radically wrong in our society. We became enemies instead of neighbors. Like Dr. Levinson said, Chile was an example of an incredible democracy, a Marxist president freely elected. What happened to us? How is it possible? And I think that we as individuals have to begin asking these questions, and then we have to come together as a community. The arpilleras are a first example on healing. They heal by telling. Narratives are a way of healing. But when I was doing this work in Chile, people didn't even know that this existed. I had to share this with my family, with my relatives, and I knew more about what was happening in Chile abroad than inside the country, because everything was censored. But I also think this is a question for us to ask: how do we heal? One interesting thing related to the story of Chile, Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, made a collective apology to the people of Chile because of the U.S. involvement in the overthrow of Allende. And for people in Chile, that was very, very important. But for people in the United States that unfortunately have a meager understanding of history, this passed through like another fast soundbite episode. So I also think that healing is about understanding the incredible power of history and the lessons from this history. But if we don't have knowledge of the past, we will repeat the same mistakes of the past, and we are repeating them over and over, all over the world, from the last genocide of the 20th century to the genocide of the 21st in Syria. So this is the question that philosophers, sociologists, physicians, people in public health address. And we have to begin somewhere.
Dr. Agosin, first thank you. Thank you for your very powerful and inspirational talk today. And we also are extremely honored to have you. I know that you have made the rounds at Drexel, and this is one of a number of talks you've given today. We would like to have a reception outside in your honor. And just before we break for the reception, please join us. I just want to mention a number of events that will be hosted this year by the School of Public Health related to this topic and public health in general. October 19th, we have the Global Health Opportunities Day, providing students with networking opportunities and workshops to help them pursue careers and experiences similar to what was described today in global health and international development. That event is also co-sponsored by the School of Public Health, Office of International Programs, COAS, International Area Studies, Office of Student Life, Pannoni Honors College, College of Nursing and Health Professions, School of Biomedical Engineering. We've really come together to put together a strong program for students who have an interest in these areas. Marian Nessel at the Academy of Natural Sciences on November 8th. Her presentation will be on food politics. Is the current food system sustainable? And she's going to discuss alarming way food processing, marketing, and sales are politicized in the U.S. This lecture is free to Drexel students, but registration is required. On November 16th, we have a public health job search seminar, and this event is designed to connect our public health graduate students to public health professionals like you to educate our students on how to go about their job and internship search. It's open for our public health graduate students to attend, as well as undergrads or anyone else interested in public health. And then we have some upcoming grand rounds speakers coming in. In January, we have confirmed Dr. Maya Rockymore, the president and CEO of Global Policy Solutions, a Washington, D.C.-based policy firm. I believe she's also the chair of the Committee to Preserve Medicaid and Social Security. She's going to speak on advanced social change strategies for the world. And on March 7th, Dr. Turi Trent, a scholar and motivator, will be our esteemed Grand Round speaker. You may have recognized her name from the story featured in Nicholas Kristof's book, Half the Sky, or her recognition on Oprah Winfrey as her all-time favorite guest. Dr. Trent will be discussing the hidden contents of African Pandora Box, the case of evaluation of HIV/AIDS prevention interventions in sub-Saharan Africa and its impact on women and girls. So thank you so much for attending today. Thank you so much, Dr. Agosin, and we look forward to your future participation. Please join us outside for our reception. Thank you.